Welcome everybody to another episode with Astrid, your APD, your dietitian with T, no C, and I've got with me Lyle McDonald. We talked about your first book, which was the women's book, and we
Right.
talked everything about PCOS,
Yes.
menopause, the menstrual cycle, and I think
Right.
those episodes were really, really insightful. And I
Oh,
think
great.
now is good for us to chat more about your new book, which is around GLP-1 and
Yes.
everything that has to do with it, which I'm very
Right.
interested in talking with you about because it has got so much noise right now. There's
Right.
so much confusion, and also there's a lot of controversy whether it is the solution for the
Right.
world's obesity epidemic or whether it is something that people should be more careful about if they are going to
Right.
use it. So,
Yes.
Lyle, welcome to the show. Tell
Again,
me
thank you for having me.
more about what initially sparked your interest in GLP-1 drugs and what motivated you to write a book in the first place.
The first question, I don't honestly know. They were always sort of on the periphery of me hearing about them. There were some people in my Facebook group that were talking about them. My colleague also, the powerlifter that I trained, she had a number of clients on them. So I was hearing and getting feedback about it. And it wasn't that I was ignoring them or against them. I just sort of, I don't know, it's just kind of in the background. And then obviously during COVID, I remember hearing, there was the shortage because there was a big TikTok thing and people that really didn't need to be using them were getting them. The more I thought about it and heard people talking about it, and like the people would come into my Facebook group because I wasn't judgmental about them, right? I just see it as a tool. And anybody who got super judgmental that, oh, just work harder, just that, just got removed because I don't have time for that. So that's what got me interested in them. But I also really realized that not only a great deal of confusion, but just misinformation and misconceptions about what the drugs are, how they work, what they actually do. And so being me, I thought, well, someone needs to write, a comprehensive book on the topic, not just the research, which is, I always have that, but also practically, because I was lurking in some GLP-1 groups and seeing the problems people were running into. And we'll talk about this. There was a whole issue with muscle loss and Ozempic face and the side effects. And I wanted to really look into that and look at, A, how prevalent these side effects really were outside of, the fear, the clickbait articles that made them sound like they were just going to, to kill you instantly, to the people that thought they were a magic pill that made it so you didn't have to do any work. And as usual, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But again, I also wanted to provide practical information in terms of this is what you need to be doing with your nutrition, with behavior changes to get the most out of the compounds. Because one thing I saw, and then I'll finish this thought, a lot of people, at least in the US, I don't know about anywhere else, as frequently as not, they would just be given the drug or a prescription, and that was it. And they were just said, all the best. And some people were being given advice, but sometimes it was terrible. One person sent me some handouts they got, and it said, eat healthy, which I don't disagree with, and brush your teeth, which I also don't disagree with, but not very helpful. And some people were getting very good advice. So I'm like, there is a lack of information about how to optimize the use of these compounds. What about exercise? What about, that sort of thing? So the book in its entirety, the first 8 chapters are the science, just the background and what the research says. And then the next, I don't know, was it 19 chapters addresses nutrition, exercise. I talk about plateaus, how to break them, long-term maintenance, how to come off the drugs for people that may want to do that down the road. Some people may not want to be on them forever or can't afford to or whatever. So I wanted to get all this information out there. So that's what I did last year and managed to get it done and published. There was part of me, I'll be honest, I thought I was going to be the first book I'm like, somebody needs to do this. Might as well be me. And I was trying to get there first. Someone beat me by 1 week, but there were actually a number of other books that had been written I was not aware of. But most of them, there was one very pop science book about it. Some of it's like diet hacks for GLP. Like they weren't the way you've read my books. No one's going to write. I mean, and I even have a chapter on how lean athletes could use them. Nobody's going to write that but me. So that was the nature of it, was just to set the record straight, again, on both sides, because I've seen confusion, fear, and anxiety, and vast misinformation.
I totally agree with you. Something I read in the introduction of your book, that you mentioned that obesity is now seen as a chronic relapsing disease.
Yes.
How does that change the way we should approach weight loss?
For decades, if not centuries, it has been seen as, a moral failing. I mean, you can go back, I found some articles on the history of weight loss, and you go back centuries, and there was, it was seen as immoral. It was a sin. Like it was, and that still persists. It's, obesity or people with overweight, it's just, they're lazy and they overeat, and sloth and gluttony and all of that. Now, make no mistake, if you look at activity levels, are they typically lower? Yes. If you look at eating habits, are they typically higher? Yes. But this is being driven neurochemically. They're parts of the brain, some of us are lucky and we enjoy exercise, or we're just spontaneously more active. There's a biology to that. Some people have a reward system that's more sensitive than others. And if they're like a hyper taster, right, like they taste foods better in the modern environment, that's going to make it extremely difficult to avoid gaining weight. Like, I'm not saying it's impossible, right? And that's the danger. I'm not saying, we don't have any free will to make choices, but it doesn't change the fact that in 50, 70 years, 100 years, the track record for diet and exercise interventions, and even most earlier anti-obesity drugs, is very poor. Like, it's not 95% fail. That statistic is bogus. But we know that in the big picture, the grand majority are not having long-term success. And yeah, we could explain it through a lot of means. Most people diet terribly, they get terrible advice, they're following diets that are unsustainable, whatever it is. But even with that, we've tried every diet, we've tried every exercise intervention, we've tried every behavioral intervention. And 50 years later, the success rates are exactly the same. So there's clearly something that's deeper under the hood. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, is now treating it as a chronically relapsing condition, no different than any other biological condition, whether it's mental illness, whatever. But what that means is it's going to require chronic treatment. Now, you could easily say, well, just chronically stay on your diet and exercise program. And there's truth to that. Because one of the criticisms, I know we'll touch on this later, is, when you stop the GLP-1s, you just regain the weight. Well, when you stop your diet and exercise program, you just regain the weight. So what's the difference? And in my mind, there isn't one. So if we accept that there is an underlying biology contributing to this, like not controlling it, I don't believe humans are, robots with no free will, but it is a contributing factor. And we have a tool that can help to reverse that. The reality is that may require chronic treatment, just like any other chronic condition. So that's really where I think the conceptualization needs to just go from, you're morally weak, it's a sin, sloth, gluttony, all this judgmental stuff, to it is a neurobiological condition and needs to be treated as such.
I totally feel like that gets so deep into why we need to understand better how obesity is such a multifactorial, super complex condition.
Yes.
And there's a lot of context that needs to be discussed when we are trying to diagnose or pinpoint at the solution of what the obesity epidemic should be. And obviously, there's so many things that we need to think about. You emphasize that lifestyle changes obviously should still be incorporated alongside GLP-1 medications. What does the ideal GLP-1 friendly nutrition and training plan would look like?
A lot of the reason, just sort of going back to where we started, that I brought that up, is there is this idea that, you just take the drug and you magically lose weight. Now, for some people, that is true. And I suppose I should talk briefly about what the drugs actually do, which is that predominantly they just suppress appetite. That's it. They are a chemically induced diet. The CEO of Novo Nordisk, who makes, I forget which one, came out last year and said it would have been tirzepatide, Mounjaro, and Zepbound, that on average, people eat 800 calories less. That's it. That's how it causes weight loss. It causes people to eat less. It's really that simple. Or it helps to facilitate behavior change. And I think that's part of what got lost. Now, make no mistake, pharmaceutical companies just want a drug that works, right? They don't like that's what the obesity market has always looked for. But at the same time, it's not recognized that in the majority of the research studies, they do give lifestyle advice. That doesn't get talked about. They just think, oh, they're just giving the drugs. Like, no, they're not given great lifestyle advice, but they're at least given something. And it's typically eat 500 calories less, 250 minutes per week of exercise, and they get one meeting, one behavioral meeting like per month. Very generic stuff, but they've got thousands of people. That's the best you can do. But if you're looking at like what would be optimal in terms of either diet or exercise, and this sort of ties in with the big fear of muscle loss, the big thing, and a lot of that comes down to the misunderstanding of lean body mass loss, which is glycogen, water, connective tissue, minerals, organs, bone, and skeletal muscle, which is part of lean body mass. People are making this confusion. But in as much as it's just causing people to eat less, we've known for decades that in a calorie-restricted condition, if anything, protein requirements go up. So I think a lot of what's happening in the general population, and this is true of dieting too, right? You're an athletic population. I work with an athletic, like you and I both know that when you're dieting, protein requirements go up. But I think if you take the average person who has a typical Western diet, which who may be eating, 40, 50, maybe 60 grams of protein per day, and you know full well that women often eat even less protein than men, and you now cut their calories by 25 to 40%, well, now their protein intake is even worse, right? They go from sort of a mediocre, and that's not meant to be judgmental. It's just sort of descriptively, higher calorie diet to a mediocre, lower calorie diet. So one of the points I really make in this book, and this is true whether someone has their appetite spontaneously suppressed, whether or not they are actually having to consciously pay attention to it, they must get enough protein. Because again, we know from decades of studies of just low calorie dieting, without higher protein intakes, you will lose lean body mass and muscle mass.
Yeah, I was going to say that even research nowadays is given kind of like the average intake for a regular female standard height is about 60 to 70 grams a day, which is not even, I think, probably half of what they should be having in the first place. So it's very, very low.
Yes. And that's at maintenance calories. And then you take them down and they're at 40 and they're at maybe, 1/3 of where they need to be. And again, we look at the decades of studies and they routinely show that, you may be looking at 80, 100, 120, depending on body weight, there's a bunch of, again, context. And this is all in the book. People that are leaner who may be using them, and they exist, they need even more protein, right? When you're dieting for a show, you need more protein than, say, a woman at 35% body fat who's dieting because her body won't use as much, but she still needs probably more than what she's getting. So I talk a lot about, if you do nothing else, here's how you set your protein. You must get that correct. And this is especially important because for those people that do get significant appetite suppression, and some people do, some people don't. There's huge variability in response. But I've seen people report I can't eat anything. They're so full all the time that they literally can't eat enough. And it's like, well, in that case, you have to prioritize protein. You cannot fill up on especially high bulk carbs and starches and things of that nature, because when you can't eat that much, you have to prioritize, and then anything additional that you can eat is left over. So that's really the key. And then, I mentioned obviously essential fatty acids, important, not as critical. Like I said, if they get one thing right, and I would say this on any diet, right? Because again, GLP-1s are appetite suppressants. What I tell people when I do consultations, I mostly care about calorie intake and protein. Carbs and fats, in one sense, don't matter, but in another, outside of the individual. If someone's training intensively, they need more carbs. If someone's insulin resistant, they may feel better on less carbs. But calories and protein are non-negotiable. So if the GLP-1s control calorie intake, the individual has to ensure protein intake.
Help me understand something. When it comes to those individuals that are weight loss resistant. They have tried
Yes.
everything. They do really do everything quote unquote well. They follow
Yeah.
the deficit, they do exercise, they do their cardio, they do their steps, they are paying attention to the lifestyle. Mostly, let's talk about the most common population that would be weight loss resistant would be like this women group in the perimenopausal transition period, where there is a lot of shifting in hormones and body composition changes.
Yeah.
How does this potential drug could or would have an impact if the main reason is appetite suppression? How does this actually make someone with weight loss resistance, just an example of the perimenopausal women, but it could be
Yeah.
anyone, have an impact or a potential benefit in this situation?
In that case, I don't think it would help at all, because
Mm,
again, literally all it's doing is reducing calories. I mean, even in that, something else that sort of got missed because it's buried in a lot of other studies, on low enough calorie intakes, the GLP-1s actually don't increase weight loss, right? So they can, like, say someone is normally eating 1,800 calories, just as an example. You give them a GLP-1 and their calorie intake goes to 1,100. But you take someone else and you put them on an 800 calorie per day diet. That person on 800 calories will lose more weight than the person on the GLP-1. But if you give them a GLP-1, they won't lose any more weight because it can't bring calorie. So if you have one of those diet resistant people, for whatever reason, whether it's hormonal, physiological, there has been a little research that I just want to mention because I think it's relevant to this. I don't think it will help. And again, what's been really I think underappreciated is just how much variability there is in the response to these drugs, right? Because what we hear about the averages and the maximums. We hear that semaglutide causes an average of 15% weight loss, and that's great. But average means that some people get more, but some people get less. And there are some subjects in these studies that at the 16-week mark have lost less than 5% body weight. The drugs simply don't work. Why? That's currently unknown. I have a whole chapter on that, what may be causing that. No one really knows. Although interestingly, women do actually respond better to GLP-1s than men. On average, they lose greater percentage of body weight and lose faster, but we'll come back to that. But there is this variability. Now, what you typically see, and I'll get back to the diet resistant thing, is with any given drug, as the dose goes up, the number of non-responders goes down. But there's still a percentage that don't get a response. And with each new drug, so semaglutide, which is Wegovy and Ozempic, tirzepatide, which is Mounjaro and Zepbound, the new one in the pipeline, retatrutide and CagriSema, with each new drug, the number of non-responders drops. So they are overcoming whatever biology is causing this to occur, but there will still probably be some percentage of people that just won't get any, because something else I talk about in the book that I think will be the future of obesity treatment when we get there will be personalized nutrition, right? The data is gradually building up. But to your point, obesity is massively multifactorial. It can be like there is a physiology, there is a psychology, and it's not that you can separate the two, but there are all these factors. And we've known for decades that a drug that works great in one person, any drug, anti-inflammatory, will do nothing in another person. And
mm,
until we find that, until we can determine like what biochemical pathway or biological pathway or what part of their physiology or behavior is the roadblock is causing the issue, once we have that, we'll be able to target a lot more clearly, right? And an example I often use, again, I'll go back to mental illness and mental health. We know that the psychiatric drug that works in one person will do nothing in another person, and vice versa. Unfortunately, it's a guess right now, right? Unfortunately, when you look at the data, here's their advice. If you used a GLP-1 for 16 weeks and lost less than 5% body weight in that time period, it's not going to work, which is fine, but is not, it just means you've wasted 4 months. Hopefully
yep.
at some point we'll be able to target this. And so here's another example. And again, I promise we'll get back to your original question. Diabetics lose less weight on GLP-1s than non-diabetics. That is a very major predictive factor. People with type 2 diabetes tend to lose less weight for some reason, for a number of reasons. There's a new drug being developed called CagriSema that's a mixture of semaglutide, right, Wegovy and Ozempic, and a drug called cagrilintide, and it mimics a hormone called amylin. It works with insulin. So you don't need to know anything more than that. But that drug particularly was more effective in diabetics than the other drugs have been because it's targeting a different pathway. Amylin has to do with insulin sensitivity in the brain. And we know that in type 2 diabetes, there can be insulin resistance. So what I suspect down the road, as these new compounds are developed that are targeting things slightly differently, we will get to the point that we can probably predict what's going on. I'd also mention, so I mentioned that women often get a better response. This ties in with the perimenopause thing. One of the reasons they think that occurs is because women are smaller. So if you give them the same dose, they have they call it higher exposure. Basically, levels are higher in their body. That's all there is to it. But it looks like there's a hormonal response or a hormonal effect. And estrogen is part of that because postmenopausal women on hormone replacement therapy get better results from GLP-1s than those not on hormone replacement therapy. So there's absolutely interaction between women's estrogen or possibly progesterone. I suspect it's estrogen and GLP-1s, but also weight loss and body composition in general. And again, to your point, at perimenopause, as estrogen starts to drop, women's body fat patterns may shift from their lower body to their upper body. They often gain weight, lose muscle. So, but the GLP-1 wouldn't target that directly. That's probably more of an issue of addressing the hormonal changes. But as far as the diet resistance, the only research I've really seen on this, there's a group that's done, they run like a weight loss clinic. So they've got like 100,000 people that they've run through this thing. And they've identified there's a population that just doesn't lose. Controlled diet, everything, no results. So they did a study on them and took diet responsive people and diet resistant people, and they put them on an aerobic training program. And what they found was that the diet resistance people got an improvement in mitochondrial function and skeletal muscle function in terms of something is going on. There's a dysregulation in their ability to produce energy, whereas the diet sensitive people didn't. And so, again, just as an example, I did a coaching call with someone several years ago, and he runs a coaching program mostly for women. And he calls me with the hard cases. And he's like, I got these 4 women. They're doing everything right. I believe their food intake, nothing. And I was like, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Have you tried? He's like, I've tried it all. Nothing on calorie restriction. And I asked him, I go, when these folks had been successful previously, what were they doing? And he said, well, they were eating more and doing more activity. And I think that ties in with this research on that. I think there is a group of individuals, and I know I keep saying women, but women are more likely to be in diet studies and dieting in the first place. So it's obviously not universal to that, but where for whatever reason, when they reduce calories, maybe their NEAT goes down, maybe their bodies adapt sooner. There's definitely research. Some people just have energy expenditure drop faster. Maybe it's because their muscles aren't able to convert fat to energy and their body goes, well, we're starving, we better, I don't know exactly, but this may be a case where doing formal aerobic activity, at least in those handful of cases, seemed to be when they, so I told him that, I said, can they do more activity and eat more? And he said, well, their lifestyle won't allow that right now. And I said, well, then I don't know what to tell you. So I think there's a lot going on. And we know at perimenopause, I mean, spontaneous activity goes down, appetite changes. I don't want to say, oh, you know, people are misestimating their calories, but there's just so much going on. And we know that HRT fixes that. So but anyway, to answer your question, assuming they're restricting their calories accurately and consistently, I don't think GLP-1s will help at all.
A follow-up of that question that I mentioned of weight loss resistant women or people, what do you think it is the solution? In terms of when we think about, if we do a further deeper assessment on what's going on, maybe in the biomarkers, do you identify there are things that are red flags in the some specific biomarkers. I could tell you maybe there's a downregulation of thyroid hormone or a specific hormonal pathways that are being affected for these particular clients or these particular women. And where's the hope for these people?
I don't have a good, I'll be honest that I haven't really looked deep to see what's out there.
Yep.
I mean, there are, we know that there are variations in energy expenditure. There, to some degree, there are variations mostly in how people adapt to calorie restriction. Some people show a very small drop. Other people show a very significant drop. Researchers back in the day had identified, again, they ran, tens of thousands of people, and they found a couple of subjects that when they cut their calories by 500, their energy expenditure dropped by 500. Their bodies adapted immediately. What are those biomarkers? I honestly don't know. And unfortunately, until we have a better idea on what's causing this, is it something in the brain? Is it leptin resistance? Is it thyroid does play a role, although it doesn't change energy expenditure as much as you think. Is it within the skeletal muscle? There's so many things that can occur, a lot of which, so, they'll look at individuals with overweight and they'll identify all these biological things going on, changes in the reward system, brain inflammation, bodily inflammation. And then the question becomes, well, did this cause the overweight, or is this an effect of the overweight? Because frequently if you can get people to lose weight, many of those factors improve, but they never completely reverse.
Yeah.
So what I've always thought is certain people are simply predisposed to weight gain. They show, like I said, they may have a higher appetite overall. They may have a reward system that just enjoys, like, I've met people that are like, I don't like sweets. And I go, what do you mean? They're just like, no, I just don't enjoy them. To me, I do like sweets. Like, there are differences in so many different variables. You put someone like that in a modern environment, they gain weight, those factors start to get worse, and it just becomes this feed-forward cycle. The hard bit being, how do you get them moving in the right direction if you, by definition, can't get them moving in the right direction? And I don't know. I don't know if we have that data right now, but I think that would be another huge step, I said, in individualized obesity treatment. So, for example, a study that I mentioned in the book, it's really interesting because it's nobody followed up on it. So what the researchers did was they defined 4 types of obesity. There was what they called hungry gut, which was when people eat the food emptied very quickly, so they didn't stay full. There's what they called hungry brain, which meant that they didn't report feeling full after a meal. There was an emotional eating group, which they figured out with an emotional eating questionnaire. And then there was what they call, it was a slow metabolic rate group that had a slightly lower energy expenditure than predicted. And so they let half of them take whatever anti-obesity medication they wanted. And then the other half, they targeted the individual types of obesity. So the hungry gut group got liraglutide, one of the early GLP-1s. I forget which one the hungry brain got. The emotional eating group got Contrave, that deals with the reward system. And the metabolic rate group did interval training. No, they got phentermine, which raises energy expenditure. And they got like 50% better weight loss. So by targeting the specific type of obesity, they got better results. They did a follow-up with diet. And so, for example, the hungry brain, I think they had to do time-restricted eating, where they ate fewer, or I forget the details. Nobody ever thought, like, to me, that was a brilliant, like, this is it. This is the answer. We need to figure out how to identify these different causes or types so that we can target them specifically. And nobody ever followed up on it. And I find it both baffling and frustrating, because until we can do that, there's going to be a population that's just gonna kind of be out of luck, which is not very helpful.
Do you remember the name of the study, or where was it published?
Oh yeah. Hang on, I can find it in the background. Oh, I'm sure I can find it relatively quickly.
Because it would be good to just look deeper into that. And I think it is interesting that study design and how it was carried on.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that it still could be followed up, or maybe if there is a second part to that is being developed in the background.
I've looked. Other than the follow-up they did that was based around diet, I've never seen anything. It seems to have just gone ignored, and I find that very surprising. I will track it down for you in any case. What
That's so
search?
good. When you have
Yeah.
it, you send it to me. But
No,
now,
yeah, absolutely.
you mentioned in your book something that sparked my interest, and you did say that this drug could actually be helpful in athletes and physique athletes, specifically trying to get lean for stage, or who wants that dieting edge of like being able to get leaner with less hunger, because one of the biggest things
Right.
getting that level of leanness is the amount of hunger and the capacity to stay adherent to that deficit. How much information have we got in there? And like, is it going to be allowed or prescribed for this particular population, given the fact that they could misuse these way more than normal people that are trying to lose weight? And the second question to follow that up is, if you did use this drug, are you considered now not natural?
So the answer to the first question is there is not and will never be any research on this. BC researchers don't care about athletes by and
Yeah.
large. You know, there's the occasional research paper in elite athletes, and it's usually about weight cycling for weight class sports, because they don't care about a group that by and large doesn't need to lose body fat. But when you're talking about physique athletes especially, and some performance athletes who are, especially for certain divisions, bodybuilding and physique, and obviously as you get into fitness, figure, bikini, wellness, the requirements are much lower. They are literally starving themselves to near death levels of body fat, right? A male bodybuilder may hit 3 to 4% body fat, the absolute lower limits before you die. A female will need to be at 10%. And the leaner you get, the worse hunger gets, the more the body adapts, because it literally it's just controlled starvation. I mean, contest prep, that's what it is. So there will never be any data on it, but it makes absolute sense that an appetite suppressant would help. And bodybuilders, have used these in the past, but it was the earlier stuff: phentermine, fenfluramine, many of those earlier drugs, a great number of which have fallen out of favor. Phentermine is still around. You probably are not old enough to remember in the 90s. So phentermine is a stimulant appetite suppressant, and fenfluramine is a non-stimulant appetite suppressant. In the 1990s, they put them together because you take phentermine during the day and then fenfluramine at night, and it would let you sleep. And it was kind of like with the GLP-1s now. It became a growth industry. It went from something like 100,000 prescriptions to like 4 million. It was somewhere, the numbers are in my book, because you could literally call up a clinic and go, "Hi, I'm overweight," and they would write your prescription. Just kind of like with the telemedicine stuff that's going on right now with the GLP-1s. And then some people had some heart problems, which weren't conclusively linked. But the point of this being that bodybuilders have always or frequently used something, because, as a mentor of mine once put it, when it comes to contest prep, the final battle happens at the refrigerator door. And I've been there, and I know you've been there. You get to a point of leanness that you can eat the perfect meal: plenty of lean protein, fibrous vegetables, moderate starches, moderate fat, and 10 minutes later, you're hungry. It's brutal. And especially if you work at home or you're not somewhere where you can keep busy, it comes down to just sheer willpower, not because your body is everything. This is when competitors will talk about getting on Instagram and they'll just be looking at pictures of food that they can't have, and your entire brain is just screaming at you to eat. And
Just
you're
so
having
food focus.
Oh yeah, this was shown in early. So there's this classic study back in the 1950s called the Minnesota Semi-Starvation Study that gets quoted a
Yep.
lot. I talk about it a lot. And they took lean men, probably 12% body fat to start, who were conscientious objectors to the war, and they put them through 6 months of 50% maintenance calories, 2 hours of forced walking a day, and they all reached about 4% body fat. But the men would sit in the food hall, like they'd get their pittance of food and be just scraping up when they put water in it to make soup to try to, and they were eating like 10 packs of chewing gum a day. Like this all, I'm sure, sounds very familiar to you, but all they just sat around thinking about, man, when this is over, the food I'm going to eat, and we should start a restaurant. Like when we get out, we should, like, all they could think about was food. And that's a change in your neurochemistry. So the GLP-1s would be a new approach to helping control appetite. I mean, and that's true of even non-athletic dieters. Even for the people that don't necessarily get spontaneous appetite suppression, and there are some people that don't, it can really facilitate making the behavioral changes. And I've had people in my Facebook group mention that. They're like, going on to even a low-dose GLP-1, they're like, that's the first time I've actually been able to adhere to the behavioral changes that I've been trying to make for years, right? They weren't using they weren't using it as a replacement. They were using it to help them stick with what they wanted to do. And that's just as powerful. But if you're talking about lean athlete, and I know some people are using them already. It's purely anecdotal feedback. It's still very early days, but I guarantee you at the pro ranks, people are using them and will continue to use them. So, and I don't think it's really going to, I mean, it's not going to change how people look at the highest levels. And that's not what the drugs do. But I think we will see more people actually making it to stage, right? You and I both know that for every one person who maybe gets to contest shape and makes it to stage, there's dozens more that never get there because they crack. I mean, it's just the reality. Like, I'm not saying it like it's just the reality of it, and they don't make it. So I think you'll see more people actually making it to stage lean because they can stick to their contest when they're in the depths of dieting misery. So far as natural, I would say someone is not. Like, I think I don't know if appetite suppressants are, actually, no, I think I looked. WADA, the drug folks, I think they do have appetite suppressants on the list of banned substances. And the way WADA regulations work, like it's not just the individual drugs. It'll be like this, and anything that blunts appetite. So I think, strictly speaking, GLP-1s will not be used by naturals. Just sort of, I mean, some natural federations won't even let you use ephedrine or even, mild over-the-counter stuff. So far as getting prescriptions, I imagine there will probably be, bodybuilding physicians that will be happy to write the prescription for it. It'll never be covered for insurance, but I know there are shady peptide sites, because I know which ones they are, I know where they are, that are selling these as research chemicals. So I know of bodybuilders, or have at least heard of bodybuilders, they're using the stuff that's not even approved yet because they can get it. They can get retatrutide, which is just probably 2 or 3 years away from approval. They can get cagrilintide, which is a couple years from approval. The average person can't, right? Is limited to liraglutide, semaglutide, and tirzepatide, which is by far and away the superior drug. But that's not going to stop them, right? If they can't get it's also a lot cheaper. I mean, I'm not recommending this, but if the GLP-1s have a huge drawback, is the cost is absurd if insurance doesn't cover it, especially in the US. So you can get a vial of this stuff from the gray market peptide sites.
There's something that I am quite interested in knowing more now, is that why is that such a huge risk of lean body mass loss in this population when they jump on these medications compared to someone who diets? Is it more because of like these deep calorie restriction and the loss of appetite, and just the fact that they don't have a really good or strong foundation in just choosing protein as a big priority, or it's
That's
more
all of
like
it.
it is already a something that people's going to go at risk just because of this medication has a potential effect on lean body mass?
No, GLP-1s don't impact on muscle metabolism. There's actually one study that in older individuals, it increases muscle mass. So it's simply a function of diet. It's simply a function of people are being calorie restricted. They're not being told to eat more protein. It's just a calorie restricted diet. Now, so far as the greater amount of lean body mass, that's actually not true. The studies are hugely varied. And we have to really distinguish between lean body mass and muscle mass because those get confused a lot, right? So lean body mass represents everything in the body that's not fat, but that means it includes internal organs, bone, water, glycogen, minerals, connective tissue, skeletal muscle. Actually, a small portion of your fat cells is lean body mass. So technically, when you lose fat, you will lose a small amount of lean body mass.
Yep.
Only about a little bit less than half of lean body mass is skeletal muscle mass. So what happens, and this is true in all diet studies, in the first 2 or 3 days, people lose water, glycogen, food residue in their gut gets cleared out. You know, people will go on low carbohydrate diets, they can lose 5 to 10 pounds, 2.5 to 4.5 kilos of water in 2 days. Now that counts as lean body mass. Obviously, that's not muscle mass. If you then carb load them, they will regain that same amount of weight. Had they gained 4.5 kilos of muscle? Don't we wish? So there's a big lean body mass loss, but of that, only a small amount is skeletal muscle. Now, we don't know how much, but it's certainly, because I've seen people say, oh, GLP-1s cause 60% muscle loss. No, 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 no. They may cause 60% lean body mass loss in some cases, but only a small portion. There's also some evidence that, without getting too deep into it, some of the supposed loss of muscle mass is changes in the muscle that are actually an improvement in their metabolic profile. I don't want to get too deep into that. But anyway, on average, so on average, the typical generically poorly, just the typical generic diet that, to your point, 50 or 60 grams of protein, low calorie, it's usually assumed that there will be about a 25% lean body mass loss, right? That's an old rule. It's more complicated than that, but that's good enough. The most recent meta-analysis on lean body mass loss on GLP-1s is an average of 28%. It's almost identical because it's just a low-calorie diet. And if you increase dietary protein, none of this happens. So it's nothing more or less than that. There are not GLP-1 receptors in skeletal muscle. So it's not, the only effect is simply it makes people eat less. And if they're in general population and are not told to eat more protein, but that would be true of any badly set up diet. And there's lots of them out there. I mean, that was at least one advantage of low carbohydrate diets, in the sense of people always increase. If you looked at the studies, when you put someone on a low carb diet, their protein intake always goes up by 30 or 40 grams because that's all you can eat. So like that was an indirect benefit, but you can do that on any diet. So it's nothing more than that. There's also, of course, the exercise component, which I think we could probably talk about next, because that's something else that's just drastically ignored.
Yeah, I totally think that that is something that needs to be part of the treatment. Like, to me, like
Absolutely.
any treatment, even like I work with bariatric patients as well. Like, and I tell all my patients, there's no diet, treatment, or weight loss strategy that is going to work if exercise and resistance training is part of the equation and behavior
Absolutely.
change. If there is no
Yep.
mindset and behavior change, your diet could be perfect. And the other way around, like you could have the best training program, the best facility next door. And if your diet is shit, you're not going to get anywhere. So
Yeah,
it definitely is like a
absolutely.
trifecta of these three things
Yes.
have to be hand in hand in order for something to work long term. But my question now
Absolutely.
is, let's say there are these three things are in place. You have made changes in your behavior, you have a solid training program, and your nutrition is on point, paying attention to your protein intake, your fiber, all of these things, nutrition quality per se. Once you somehow have achieved your goal weight
Hmm.
under the medication, what is next? Is Are you meant to use this medication for life? If you take it, what happens with your appetite suppression? Does that go
Right.
completely back to normal? What's the diet or the lifestyle or the strategy after
Right.
GLP-1?
Yes. And I dedicate an entire chapter to this because this is so important. It's important for every diet. I mean, to your point,
Yeah.
people go on diets and they frequently think of them as, oh, I'm going to eat like this until I reach my goal, and then I'm going to stop eating like this. And I wish it worked that way. I do. If it did, I would tell people that, but we know that that doesn't. I mean, if you go even further back in the research, people used to think of these are diet foods and these are non-diet foods. They were very distinct. So they would eat these foods to lose weight, and then they would go right back to their old way of eating. And of course, they regained weight. That was also a time when diet foods were all terrible. Like the way people used to diet back in the day, my mom tells me stories that are just of women sitting there eating plain tuna fish on lettuce. Like that's just how you dieted. And it was, or with cottage cheese, which I personally don't care for. But now there are diet foods that are delicious, right? Like there's many low calorie foods that are just taste just as good. In any case, so with the GLP-1s, okay, so you've used this, you've reached your goal, or you've simply hit a plateau. What comes next? Now, in premise, given that it's a chronically relapsing condition, you could stay on it forever. Right now, we only have data up to about the 4-year mark. And frequently what they do in the research is, so they put people on and they lose so much weight and they go, okay, you come off and you stay on. And the people who come off start to regain at some rate, and the people who stay on usually lose more, or they at least maintain in the long term. Whereas the people who come off come back, many of them start regaining weight. Now, it's not universal, but a percentage does keep the weight off. What are they doing or not doing? I don't know the studies, but there's a large number of studies that people like to chime in on. So they do the GLP-1 for a year, and then the researchers go, okay, we're done. Bye-bye, get out. And they take them off the drug, and people's weight rebounds. Because when you stop them immediately, all right, so let's go back to your example of physique athletes. Hunger is just absolutely through the roof. And that happens as we lose weight. So if someone has lost 20 kilos on a GLP-1, the drug has kept their appetite under control. If they instantly go off, hunger goes boosh and goes screaming up. And of course they're going to start eating again. Like there's no way to get around it. And so that's led a lot of people to go, oh, if you stop, you gain the weight. Well, yeah, if you stop dieting, you regain the weight too. So I don't see a difference. But that's a terrible way to come off the drugs.
Yeah.
And that's and right at the end of last year, I actually did happen to sort of write my book. I got delayed in the middle of the year. I didn't finish it till the end. And some really good research came out that speaks to this about better long-term strategies. So some people may just choose to stay on. Now, do we know what the effect of that is 20 years down the road? No, but I mean, these drugs have been studied since the 90s. It's not, I see people go, oh, there's just not enough research. Liraglutide's been around forever. Semaglutide is, at least a decade. They don't realize what hoops companies have to jump through to get FDA approval, regardless. But we don't know. Maybe 30 years down the road, people grow an extra leg. Like, I don't know. But we have to ask, are those potential negatives worse than what we know occurs with chronic long-term overweight?
Okay.
But there's the cost. Like, so some people may either need to stay on them permanently or choose to. someone I consulted with, who again, who's fought for years with their eating. Their weight's gone up and down. I consulted with them earlier this year, and they said last January, they went on Mounjaro. They were a hyper responder. They did it with my rapid fat loss diet. 1 year, down 50 pounds, never hit a plateau, still losing, actually. They asked me, when should I stop? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, at some point, kind of has to, but don't know the answer yet. And I asked her, I said, do you want to talk about coming off? And she said, nope, not going to risk it. I plan to stay on forever. All right, that's a personal choice, but she's also on a low dose. Okay, so you get to goal. Ideally, you've used that to improve your overall behavior patterns, right? And if nothing else, we know that most diet and exercise interventions, just your typical, start to fail at what, the 12-week mark, maybe the 20-week mark if you're lucky. We know that longer-term interventions have greater success because it gives people a better chance to build habits, which do take time. I mean, and that's, again, you and I have seen that. I know you see that with clients. People are like, okay, I've eaten this way for 20, 30, 40 years, and I expect to turn that around in 3 months. Nope, sorry, those habits are very well ingrained. This takes time. Even if the GLP-1 does nothing but let someone make those changes for a year, that gives them a chance to develop those habits. Okay, so what this one paper found, they took this group of people that had used the drug to get to their goal, and then rather than coming off immediately, they gradually tapered down. Right. And there's a number of ways to do this. You can take the same dose every 2 weeks. You can take half a dose every week. You could maybe take a full dose every 10 days, somewhere in the middle, and levels in your bloodstream will drop a little bit. And then you assess, right? So rather than stopping cold turkey and having your hunger jump off, you bring it down a little bit, like 25, it'd probably be about 25% the blood levels of the GLP-1 in your bloodstream. Maybe hunger's up a little bit. That's a chance to work on, really intensify those behavior patterns. And that's what these folks did, right? Presumably they were exercising. Like, there are strategies you and I both know. Increase your protein intake more. That's the most filling nutrient. Make sure you're getting enough fiber. For some people, exercise blunts hunger. For other people, it stimulates. Like, for any given individual, there will be strategies. Some people do better with intermittent fasting, with time-restricted eating, because they can eat the same amount of food later, in a shorter eating window. These are all possible strategies. And you stay there until you stabilize. Maybe it's 2 weeks, maybe it's a month. It doesn't matter. It matters for the individual. And I really emphasize this in the book. What works for anybody else doesn't matter, right? I've got my own eating strategies that work for me. You've got ones that work for you. Those don't work for someone else. Doesn't matter what works for us. Same thing here. So these folks would taper it down gradually. And on average, it took them about 9 weeks to taper off completely. And it only worked for a percentage, partly because they were losing touch with people in the study. But a percentage was able to come off completely by doing it gradually.
Okay.
But importantly, and this is actually something I recommend with diet in general, we can talk weight loss maintenance. We should do a whole separate podcast on the way I approach that now. But what they did is, if they started to regain a little bit of weight, I mean, like 1.5%, a few pounds, they would go back on the GLP-1 for a little while to take it back off and then come off the drug again. So rather than using it long term, they were able to use it at whatever frequency. And so what I recommend in the book is, okay, let's say you taper down and eventually come off completely. A couple months later, your weight's up a little bit. All right, go back on for a month, take it back down. But importantly, look at what happened in those previous 3 months. What did you do? What didn't you do? What new things can you try, so that during this next block, maybe you make it 6 months and then your weight's up a little bit and then you go back on. People also forget, maintenance takes practice.
It's a skill.
Oh, absolutely, it's a skill. But again, people have to figure out what strategies work best for them. And it just depends on the person. So the key with this, the way they use the GLP-1, the way I tell people to approach diet is, if your body weight climbs up a little bit, that's normal. You're not a failure. You're just human, right? That's life.
Yep.
If you're just dieting in general or have been dieting in general, well, tighten things up, right? Do a couple weeks, make sure you're tracking your calories right, bump it, take it back off, and then assess. And same thing here. They're just using the GLP-1 to facilitate stabilizing those changes. So that's one strategy. Another that has been thrown around in the research would be to come off the GLP-1 and transition to one of the earlier appetite suppressants. So metformin, phentermine, Contrave, which helps with the reward system, which is something else the GLP-1s happen to target, because they're less expensive. There's not going to be a shortage like there was of the GLP-1s at one point. So that's another. So I try to present multiple options, ranging from you may have to stay on it forever at a full dose. Some people may taper down and never come off completely, but they'll be on the lowest dose, just enough to take the edge off. Some can come off completely. Some can come off completely and use it intermittently. Some may come off and consider another drug if they need it. But any given individual won't know until they get there to see how they're going to respond. There was also the one paper that I think brings us to exercise, and maybe that's where you want to sort of finish up. There's only been one paper using formal exercise with these drugs. One. I mean, they tell them to exercise 150 minutes a week, which is fine, and that's generic, but not really fantastically useful. Not really. But again, when you've got thousands of people, there's only so much you can do. I get that. So what this particular paper did that was really interesting, because it speaks to the maintenance thing. So first they lost weight on a diet by itself. And then they had 4 groups. One got nothing, and they regained weight, and we don't need to worry about them anymore. One was put on liraglutide, which is one of the earlier drugs that it's okay. It's not fantastically strong, but that's what they did. Another did exercise, added exercise. Now, it was very intense. It was interval training, but importantly, they had a trainer and they did 2 supervised classes a week. And that isn't what people normally do. You and I both know that all that great interval research in that they do out in the real world, people don't do that. And research has shown that that's the case. People will do stuff in a research study to make the people with the clipboards happy that they will not do in the real world. So the fact that there were 2 formal classes, they were still in a research study, there are limitations. Anyway, so one group got liraglutide only, one group got exercise only, and one group got liraglutide plus exercise. All right, so they did a year, they did the diet, they followed them for a year. And what they found was that both the liraglutide only and the exercise group only lost about the same amount of additional weight, but the exercise group gained some muscle and lost more body fat, which is what we'd expect. It also improved bone mineral density. Like, that's no surprise, quite honestly. And just because it bears saying, like, well, I'll come back to that thought. And then the liraglutide plus exercise group had the best result. They lost the most additional weight on top of gaining muscle, losing, which is what you'd expect as well. All right, so second year, well, we can include liraglutide and exercise, both about the same for additional weight loss, the combination better. So they did a third year. And then they said, okay, you're done. Go with God. We'll see you in a year. And they followed up with them. And now the results were very different. The liraglutide only group gained back the most weight. Because of course they did. If the entire change they had made was just taking liraglutide, well, as soon as they went off of it, there was nothing to maintain, right? They went back to their old, because their hunger went up. Like, of course. The exercise group regained some weight, but much less. And I don't remember the numbers. They're in the book somewhere, or maybe even not. Because presumably with a year of intense exercise training, again, supervised, 2 out of 4 sessions, they had a habit they could maintain. And they did. They still reported doing over 100 minutes of fairly high intensity activity. Which, again, you and I know does not happen in the real world. So and then Bizarrely, their liraglutide plus exercise group regained in between the two, but they had lost more, so they had more to regain. It seems confusing. You're like, how could the combination regain more than exercise? But it's because they'd lost more. Regardless, the point of it this really makes is A, the benefit of exercise, but B, that is yet another behavior that can be maintained if someone wants, but that's it. That's the entirety of formal exercise. So researchers starting to write papers, going, will exercise, you'll laugh at this, will exercise optimize results from GLP-1s? Well, of course they will. I mean, that's like saying, will exercise optimize results from a low-calorie diet? Well, we know that it does. I get where they're coming from because it hasn't been studied. And what they said is, well, we don't know what the optimal exercise would be. However, we have 50 years of research on low-calorie diets that tell us what it is. And you and I both know the answer. And I've been saying this for decades. I know you've been saying it your whole career. If someone does one type of activity only, it must be resistance training, period. I refer to it in the book as the protein. Protein is the single most important nutrient. Resistance training is the protein of exercise, was how I put it, to try to really drive that home. It's because we know that in a deficit, it will prevent muscle loss. It may even increase muscle mass in beginners, not by much, but it certainly can. But importantly, it takes so little time relative to the benefits. Because the biggest roadblock people report for regular exercise is time, right? We live in a very busy world. Telling someone, oh, I want you to build up to, an hour of aerobic activity 6 days a week. Well, good luck. We also know that in beginners, the number of calories they can burn with activity is very low. Now it can increase over time, but that takes months, right? This whole, you're like, oh, walk the fat off, go walk for 30 minutes. Yeah, you burned 150 calories 3 times a week. That's not even a pound a month, right? It's just insignificant compared to what you can do with diet. So if the drug is reducing your calorie intake by 750, well, there's your deficit. You don't need aerobic activity for fat loss. You add resistance training twice a week for 20 or 30 minutes, you're going to get all the benefits that you need. Again, that doesn't mean you can't add aerobic activity and build it up over time. There was a paper years ago, and they took beginners, and the first month they were burning 100 calories 6 days a week. By the end of 6 months, they were burning 600. But that's how long it takes to build up your fitness level. Yep. So yeah, 2 days a week, full body, 20 to 30 minutes in and out the door. We'll get it. Will be sufficient, especially in the early stages. Because something I do think is forgotten, and I mean, you work with bariatric patients, so I think you're probably more sensitive to this. We often forget as fitness people, most of us have never been severely overweight. It's hard to understand what someone who's carrying 50 extra pounds, telling them, oh, I want you to do a bunch more exercise, is not realistic. Simply from just a simple physicality standpoint. For many people carrying a lot of extra body weight initially, they may not be able to do much formal exercise until they've lost some amount of body weight that will make it, like you often see in people with overweight, as they lose weight, their daily activity goes up simply because it's easier to move around. NEAT will often go up. So in this liraglutide study, they dieted them hard for 12 weeks. And they lost some really, it was 28 pounds, 13 kilos in 12 weeks. It was a really hard diet. And then they were able to do exercise. And they did a 6-week ramp up and then started the interval program in the class. So but basic weight training, said 20 minutes, even if it's body weight stuff, just something goes so far. And we also know finally, and then I'll let you talk, that aerobic activity tends to have its biggest benefit at maintenance because it burns more calories and gives you a little more calorie buffer. So if your hunger's up, you're eating a few hundred more calories. Well, if you can bump your aerobic activity up, it helps to offset that.
What would be your main recommendations when it comes to managing and achieving your dream body? And if this truly requires you to use an additional tool such as a weight loss medication or a weight loss drug, or whether you do it on your own, what are the things that are needed essentially to actually get there?
Wow, that's interesting. It's a good question. Let me think about this for just a second. I mean, I think it's going to sort of summarize what we talked about,
Yep.
is that losing body fat fundamentally comes down to a consistent calorie deficit. How you do it, there's a million ways to do it. And as much as people argue about the best diet and the optimal diet, if there was one, we'd know by now. I mean, there is one in a general sense, that it must be calorie restricted, pardon me. It must have sufficient protein, and everything else is contextual. For some people, low carb diets help them control their food intake, right? If they have trouble with starches and carbohydrates, and if stopping eating those makes it easier to control calories, great. For some people, low fat diets do the same thing. That depends on the person and their body weight, their body fat, their activity level, insulin sensitivity, food preferences, food triggers. But it must be calorie restricted and sufficient protein, right? You need calorie restriction to cause the fat loss, sufficient protein to help prevent muscle loss, and then at least resistance training to either maintain or ideally increase muscle mass. Because without all three of those, right, if you just have a calorie deficit, you will lose weight, and some portion of it will be fat, and some portion of it will be muscle. And we hear that from people all the time. They lose a bunch of weight, and they just end up being a smaller version of themselves, but they're not happy with the physical appearance. And I would mention, there are people using GLP-1s who don't need to lose weight, who are very skinny, and are using them to just maintain that body weight without effort. And they typically they don't look great because they're not exercising. They're not caring about, all they're caring about is, I just don't want to eat. And they don't typically, like, you can be skinny and not look healthy. And that's
Skinny
what's
fat.
happening. Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what's happening. So just the deficit alone, you will lose weight. And without the deficit, you won't lose anything, no matter what anybody says. That's required. If you just added the protein, that would be a good step. And for beginners who are carrying excess body fat, the risk of muscle loss is relatively low to begin with, just because of the physiology involved. But in terms of building what I think most people think of as, now, like, if we were to ask a woman and a man what their dream physique is, we would probably get very different answers. But if you're like, in the most general sense, we're talking about having some degree of muscle. Men would say muscle mass, and women would say muscle tone, and it's exactly the same thing. It means having some degree of muscle to give you a certain appearance. And again, women and men have different goals in that regards. Men want big upper bodies, and women typically want better lower bodies. And there's been a huge booty emphasis in the last, for a number of years, and that's just the way things are. But you're not going to get that without resistance training. And if you just did those three things, you will absolutely make progress towards that goal. Now, what about aerobic activity? We know, research has shown repeatedly, calorie deficits plus resistance training compared to aerobic deficit plus resistance training generate the exact same results. All aerobic activity is really doing is creating a deficit, which is fine. For people that don't want to eat less, go ahead.
Yeah, but it also, like, if you think about just exercise coming through the aerobic exercise, we can't neglect from the point of view of the benefits of your cardiovascular health, your
absolutely,
mitochondrial efficiency, and all of those things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, no, absolutely. I'm talking like purely in terms of body composition.
Results,
even going back to the GLP-1 thing, is like, even if the GLP-1 will let you maintain without exercise, if you just stay on it forever, it would be ridiculous to not recommend people be active just because of the benefits of activity, right? So yeah, no, I'm not dismissing in terms of cardiovascular health and general fitness and all of that. But if you're talking about just purely physique, I'm looking at it from just the purely physiological perspective. And, aerobic exercise can help. It allows you to eat a little bit more. It probably optimizes fat burning pathways. It is important for other, certainly, health reasons. But it would be basically putting those factors together: deficit, sufficient protein, some amount of resistance training. And I think a lot of people don't realize just how little it takes, especially early on, because they see, what someone who's very advanced is doing or who does need a lot of work. And they're like, oh my God, I don't have 6 days per week to train. I'm like, I don't personally have 6 days a week. I won't do it anymore. I'm like, beginner, twice a week gets you 80% of the results that 3 days a week gets. You may increase that over time, but the key initially is just, and for most people, I dare say, if they're carrying more body fat, fat loss is the primary goal, not muscle gain, right?
Yep.
That's really the deficit long term. But that doesn't mean resistance training isn't important. To start developing that habit too, and learning how to lift weights and what muscles work what and what exercises fit your body and all those things. So generally speaking, I think for most people, the fat loss should come first as they maintain or build a little bit of muscle, and then they can focus on, building up the muscle mass where they want it for whatever their goals are. But yeah, those 4 factors have always been it. The problem has always just been getting people to do it consistently.
Consistency is the key here at the end of
Well,
the day.
that's the other thing. I don't follow much fitness social media because it just makes me even more annoyed than I already am. But there's so much, people have always looked for secrets, and that's just human nature. I'm not saying, it just is. When I was younger, I did it. You probably did it early on. We've all done it at one point, and then you realize that consistent work on the basics is what will get you 95% of the way there. But all, the do this, never do that, has to be optimized and this perfectly and this and that and the other. And then you look at the people who are actually successful in their sports, and they're doing the same boring basic stuff, but they're doing it consistently and they're doing it well, by which I mean many people just go into the gym and go through the motions. They like showing up is the important step, but just showing up isn't all that matters.
Yep.
Like in this, like the one I see that's still, yes, fine, I'm old and okay, boomer, and it aggravates me to no end, is people just, they're on their phone more than they're training, right? They do a set, then they sit on the machine for 10 minutes. Like Instagram will wait. I promise it'll still be there when you're done. But doing it consistently and working hard enough to get benefits. Because if you look at the successful, they're not paying attention to social media. They're not worrying about this exact joint angle and this and that and the other. They're doing the basics consistently, but they're doing it well, paying attention to what they're doing, focusing on what muscle that they're working, those types of things, working hard enough. And I don't mean grinding themselves into dust necessarily. So yeah, that will get you, what you find when you finally figure that out is that consistently, once you get that, all these little magic tricks don't add much. But until you get that, none of these things do anything, right? Like this is always the base of the pyramid. So, I imagine, at some point I would love to just pick your brain, like probably even in contest prep. Do you do much differently than when you're off season?
Not really.
In a global sense, like, yeah, you do more cardio and your calories are down and slightly, but it's mostly diet.
It's the
And I'm
same
sure,
thing. Yeah.
basically it's the same thing. You don't have to change that much. And I think, again, when you look at most who get to where they want to be, eventually they make that realization, that long-term consistency. And it's the same thing with diet and fat loss. And that doesn't mean that you have to be rigid 100%. 1% mistake means that you failed. Like nobody's perfect all the time. That's another thing, going back to why people fail so much. There is this belief that like, oh, if I'm not perfect, I'm weak. I'm weak-willed. I'm a failure. There's that whole psychology. And getting past that is crucial for long-term results. to realize that that one deviation or that one missed workout doesn't mean you've lost all your gains. You move past it and, get back on the horse and get back to it. It just happens. But learning those things does often take time. Not helped that we are beset by so much information. Like, it's so much worse now than when I was younger. When I was growing up, we had the magazines. Once every month, we got given all the new magic workouts. But that was it. So every month you would see everybody in the gym change their workouts. And then the internet started, and most of the early websites were like once a week or a couple times a week. And then they went to 3 times a week and 5 times a week. Some of these websites, it's like 7 articles a day. And half of them contradict everything else. They contradict each other on any given day about what's exactly what you should be doing. Then we had social media. You can go on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook Reels, YouTube, and every minute find the new thing you must do, shouldn't do, always should do, never should do. Is it any wonder people are confused? Right? I'm not criticizing people necessarily, but
the amount of information
is it's just absolutely absurd. And if you don't come from this field, and those people training do not, there's no way for people to sift through any of it to know what's good, what's bad, what's okay. It's an industry that's not good in a lot of ways, and it never has been. It's always been like this to some degree, but now it's just a million times worse when everyone can be an influencer based on nothing but your guy have abs or big arms, and if your girl have a big butt or a good nice butt, and you're suddenly an expert. And that's kind of all, and it's unfortunate because people are being misled completely. But yeah, that's that. I mean, if I ask you the same question, I'm curious. If someone came to you and said, Astrid, how do I get my dream body? What would you tell them?
I would basically say you just need to adhere to and master the basics and do them consistently every single fucking day of your life.
Yeah.
Don't overthink about doing extra magical things. At the end of the day, if you can master the basics, and mastering the basics is managing your energy balance, having an adequate amount of protein intake, looking at the quality of your diet being 80-20, and training consistently, doing resistance training, at least 3 days a week. If you can, a little bit more, a little bit less, that's fine. But doing that consistently, having some form of aerobic activity and getting your steps in, managing your stress, sleeping well. That's it.
I suspect for most people, the hard bit, especially in the modern world, managing stress and sleep is often the hard part.
But it's huge.
Oh, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
It's like you can have like amazing diet, but if your sleep is shit, you're not going to be very consistent managing your appetite and hunger and your energy levels. And then we see that in menopausal women that struggle with sleep. Like the amount of like the shifts in their body composition are going to happen, and that weight gain most likely because there's one thing that is being interrupted that is a snowballing effect on the rest of the things that they're doing. Like if their sleep is shit and they can't rest correctly and recover enough, the training is going to be shit. They're going to be hungrier. The appetite is going to be increased. The satiety is going to be lower. So that's going to make things like so steep high. Like they won't be able to do what the things that we're doing before. Even if it's like, I'm doing exactly the same. No, you're not. Because the amount of output and the intensity that perhaps you're putting into the gym, the motivation and the intensity is not the same as when you feel 100% yourself.
Which I also think, you mentioned having a snowball effect. It becomes this worsening cycle. It's like, okay, sleep, your appetite's bad, your diet's not as good, your training starts to suffer, so your body composition may start to suffer as a consequence, and it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And I maintain, I wrote the women's book, and having written that, I will say with no exaggeration, I'm glad I don't have to go through it. Like, it is what women have to go through, the shifts that their entire lifespan, from puberty through that 30 or 40 years into perimenopause, menopause. Like, men have it so much easier in that regard. So truly, truly we do. But I still also am of the general opinion, I think women, and this is often forgotten, on average have more stress than men, because even in the modern era, still expected to, I mean, frequently, most families are going to need 2 incomes to survive in the modern era. So now we've got full-time job, frequently housekeeping duties, if there's a family, child rearing duties, taking care of the big child, all of that. And then women are trying to then impose absurd amounts of training and exercise on top of that. And then they wonder why they end up burnt out, exhausted, and all of that. Like, there's so much more, I think there's so much more going on in the average woman's life compared to the average guy's, that just adds to everything that you said. And menopause, I mean, I'm in a friend's, Amanda Thebes, her menopause group. It's awful in the sense of what women are going through, the side effects from the sleep, appetite, body composition, anxiety, depression, all of it. It's really tough. It's really tough, which makes all of this that much more difficult. But unfortunately, that, it's not sexy. It's not, it doesn't sell lots of books. But it's like, yeah, that's, I joked that my job is to take, eat less, exercise, repeat forever, and turn that into a 300-page book, because that's essentially what long-term fat loss comes down to. As depressing as the repeat forever bit. That's the hard part. But the reality is, there has to be some degree of vigilance to diet, no matter what you do. Now, again, in the future, like finishing up with the GLPs just in this regard, they are now talking about drugs. Right now, the longest acting drug is 1 week, right? You have to take it weekly. One company is working on a once a month injection. I have read that someone is working on a once a year injection. Like, we may get to the point, I don't know if this will happen, to be able to rewire that. Like, I don't know if you could rewire the system permanently. It'd be fantastic if you could. I tend to doubt that's going to occur. But like, in terms of long-term use, we know that like Depo-Provera is once every 3 months. If there's a way to do it, billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies are going to figure out the repeat forever bit, just to give someone a drug that stays in their system for 2 years. Because the once a month drug maintained weight for 150 days after people came off. But that's about how long it takes to clear. So that makes me wonder, okay, if you reached your goal, could you just take a top-up shot once a month? Or once every 4 months? And then be fine? Like, use it 4 times a year and maintain in the long term? Don't know. But the future of these drug compounds, in terms of this stuff, are going to be absurd. Like, every new drug development has, retatrutide, they're seeing weight loss results 25 to 30% of body weight. That's approaching the low levels of bariatric surgery. That's crazy. And that was also a big part of why I wanted to write this book, in terms of the whole, it's cheating, it's a crutch, it's this, it's that, it's the other. It's a tool. And it is, I think, the greatest advancement in the tools we have to treat overweight that we've ever had. All the previous anti-obesity drugs, maybe 10%, maybe. These are now approaching 25 to 30%. And who knows where they're going to go down the road. Nothing is this powerful. And if they can work out some of the side effect profile, which are not nearly as bad as people think, work out, make sure there's no very long-term effects. Like, the biggest problem being that only people with money can afford them. Like, that's still the biggest drawback, is the cost.
Now, let me ask you something that you may or may not have the answer to, but if you were to compare the effectiveness and like benefits, drawbacks, do you think these GLP-1 drug medications could completely outpace and replace bariatric surgery, which has been so far like somehow the most effective when it
Right.
comes to reducing and reversing lots of these chronic health conditions
Yeah.
at the level of morbid obesity?
Yeah, well, because to your point, bariatric surgery is usually considered the most effective, like permanent change, even though it's not. I mean, people can regain weight. Retatrutide is getting to the lowest levels of bariatric surgery. Now, it seems like there has to be a limit, I think. There has to be a limit to how much weight these drugs can actually cause, but we haven't found it yet. So far as reversing all these health issues, that gets talked about a lot. And this is true. They're seeing, reductions in heart disease, PCOS, diabetes, stroke, all these other things. And a lot of that is being ascribed supposedly to like magical effects of the GLP-1s. They're like, oh, there's GLP-1 receptors in the kidney, to which I say, why? But that's neither here nor there. We know that weight loss improves this. We know that these drugs, will it reach the effectiveness of bariatric surgery? I don't honestly know. That's not an area I've ever looked into very much. You probably know way more about it than I do. I do know that there has been some work, which again, I didn't look into deeply, that they have used the GLP-1s post-bariatric surgery to maintain in the long term. And I know someone in my Facebook group who did it exactly that way. What's actually interesting, just because I find this interesting, some of the changes that occur in bariatric surgery are part of what pointed people to this GLP-1 pathway. Because we know that in people with overweight, they either don't produce GLP-1 well after a meal or their body doesn't respond to it. With bariatric surgery, they would do the surgery and they would see these massive improvements in appetite and health and insulin sensitivity way before weight loss occurred. And the question was then why? And part of it was that they were seeing greatly increased levels of GLP-1 in the bloodstream because of what they were doing in the stomach area. And it was working better. So that seemed to be a big part of what bariatric surgery was doing biochemically. I mean, on top of just preventing people from eating as much. So that was a big part where they're like, okay, maybe there's something in this GLP-1 pathway. So will it exceed bariatric surgery? I don't know. I think in a way it would be great if it did, in the sense of probably better an injection than a massively invasive surgery, if you can avoid it.
Yeah.
I also saw it just randomly, because these things are also just like upending the economy of many businesses. So in the US, Walmart is already seeing a decrease in profits because people are buying less types of certain foods. And companies are already working on GLP-1 friendly junk foods, because of course they are, but they always do. They will end up making it worse again. But they approved, I want to say, semaglutide for the treatment of sleep apnea, because we know that that's related to overweight. We know that people lose weight. Sleep apnea typically improves. One of the CPAP companies, their stock dropped. They lost like billions overnight because people are like, well, we won't need CPAPs anymore because we've just give people this medication. So like these drugs are really changing the world one way or another. And I think the future, like the only nice thing about me having written my book when I did, none of the new drugs are going to be approved for like 3 to 10 years. So everything I wrote in my book will be correct for at least that long. At which point I might have to revise it. Or we'll have drugs that are so powerful that you won't need lifestyle intervention anymore.
That's good. Well,
For good or for bad.
I have enjoyed so much this conversation.
Yes,
Thank you so
thank you
much
so much.
for having the time to just discuss all of the things that you've written in your book. Where can people
Yes.
find your book, and where is it available?
So this time, this book I didn't put on my website. It is actually available on Amazon.com. It's called The GLP-1 Solution, a complete guide program to maximize your weight and fat loss. So my name is on it. So, and I've got the coolest cover of any of the GLP-1 books, trust me, because a friend of mine made it for me. So it is available on Amazon in Kindle format, and you can get soft cover and hard copy if you want a cool table book. It's $9.95 for the Kindle, and it is currently on Kindle Unlimited. Some people are having problems either finding it, or Amazon will tell them it's not available in some other countries. For some reason, if you go to Amazon through the app, you can't buy Kindle books. It's some dumb thing with the Apple Store. So you have to use a browser on either your phone or your desktop. And like I said, every once in a while, someone will be like, I can't, it won't show me it being available. I don't know why, and I had no control over that. But yeah, Amazon.com, you will want to go to whatever your specific Amazon.com country, Amazon.com in the US, whatever your country specific Amazon is. And if you can't, if it says it's unavailable, go try one of the other countries and you should be able to get it. And if you've got a real problem, you can just email me. So that's where the book is. I also have a little, if you want to read, I put the entirety of the second chapter on a little separate website. I'll send you the link to that. It's called the GLP-1 Solution book.com, because someone else had my title. And it's got, so if you just want to read the second chapter, get a feel for the tone and the information, you can. And then there's a link from there to the Amazon.
Awesome.
The Amazon
Perfect.
sales page.
I look forward to get this published in a couple of weeks, and
Awesome.
I'll send you links and I'll send you everything so we can put the information out there for more people to know. All right, Lyle, have a great week, and I'll speak to you very soon.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.